Taking the stage is Susanne DesRoches.
Hi, everyone. So that's the best way to start a talk is to have to do some sort of breathing meditation ahead of time. So I feel lucky about that. So I'm going to talk to you today about my sort of 25-year design and policy trajectory. It's going to be a very different talk than the previous one, but the basis of the talk is really to show how, as an industrial designer, I use that methodology and that way of problem solving in order to transition into the world of policymaking, which I know is not something that designers are very frequently known for being policymakers. So I'm going to start with the beginning of my career. So I went to Pratt in the 90s, and when I graduated from Pratt, I had spent a lot of time studying space analysis with a professor named Kate Hickson. Some of you may know, she still teaches at Pratt. And what I learned from Kate was not only sort of this way to think about space and how space can do some of the things that we were just hearing about in terms of comfort and sending messages, but also that it can be used as a way to send messaging and to really look at how can we address some societal issues. The first exhibition that I worked on with her, you can see here in this slightly dated photograph, was from 1997, and this is Kofi Annan in the UN in New York City. And he's opening excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. He's opening an exhibition that was done to raise awareness around the stigma attached to people affected with leprosy, right? So this was the first thing that I worked on coming out of school, was this really meaty issue. You know, leprosy is a disease that gets labeled. People are still to this day labeled as lepers, and is something that folks really don't have a great awareness around the stigma. So this was my first foray into design, and it went on to be a traveling exhibition that went around the world for a number of years. I was fortunate to get to travel with it. And really, the content was very eye-opening. So people that are affected with leprosy today still can be divorced with no property rights, just from being affected by what is an entirely curable disease. So we used design, and we used graphics, and we used imagery to try to raise awareness for folks that are seeing this topic for the first time, really what this impact still is today. Another exhibition that I worked on in the late 90s was one that traveled with a UN treaty to ban landmines. This was roughly in 1997, 1998. And this exhibition that we designed also traveled with the delegates as they went from different UN headquarters in the US and in Europe to really try to get as many signatories to the treaty as possible. Again, we used a number of different design techniques to try to raise people's awareness. There's been, since World War II, just a huge proliferation of landmines around the world. Sadly, the US was never a signatory to that treaty, still is not to this day. But many other countries were, and many countries have both systematically stopped producing landmines as well as trying to get them out of the ground in places that they exist today. So we also did a fair amount of corporate work, mostly to do with corporate lobbies. So you can see here, this is Pfizer World Headquarters on 42nd Street. In that project, which went on for a number of years and was multifaceted since we were renovating the entire headquarters, we collaborated with a stained glass artist named Brian Clark from the UK, and you can see his work here. So that's the exterior on your left, and in the interior you can see the glass art in the ceiling. You know, Pfizer developed penicillin and has this sort of great history of medicine development. And so we incorporated a number of ways to display some of the artifacts of their history throughout the lobby as a way to kind of engage visitors around this rich history We also worked with Ernst Young. This was their new headquarters, roughly in the early 2000s, 42nd Street. So we did all of their branding and their exterior marketing work. So in 2005, I left Hickson Design and went to ESI Design. Also did a lot of exhibition work there, but mainly had a basis of corporate clients. You can see here, this is a CVS store. We did some new graphics for them. I did work for McDonald's, for Best Buy. But the client that I enjoyed the most was Mercy Corps. And Mercy Corps it is still a disaster relief organization. And they built what they called a Hunger Action Center. It was in Battery Park City. It's no longer there. And where basically visitors could come in, and no matter what amount of time they had or resources they had, they would give them a solution to a small problem that they could actually execute themselves. So it was a very interactive place. And this project, for me, was a really sort of watershed moment. I was 12 years in to a design career. I had moved up to a director level, and I started to really evaluate my own values and what I liked about design and what I wanted to do going forward. And for me, that was all about content that helped solve major thorny issues. And it really wasn't interesting to me to work in the retail space and to work in other spaces that were solving a problem that was around profit and not a problem that was around society. So in my mid-30s, I did what any sane person would do. I quit my job and I went back to school. So here I am on graduation day. I ended up going to Columbia to a one-year program, a master's in public administration, which is basically like an MBA, but for government. And I focused on environmental science and policy. And I went to a one-year program. It was very intensive. And one of the reasons I chose it was a whole semester on climate science. And this was 2008. People talked about climate change. We called it global warming, actually, at that time. We should go back to calling it global warming. But I really wanted to understand the data and the science behind it and be able to incorporate that content into what I did as a design professional. So, let me just go. Can you go back one? So at the end of my stint at Columbia, it was the summer of 2008. And I took the summer off because it had been a very intense year of school. And then the stock market crashed in the fall. And so I was like, this is not a great situation for me professionally. And I sort of looked at what my options were. I did have a job offer at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And I thought, well, it's government, it's stable, I'm gonna go there while the Great Recession sort of happens around us, and after a couple of years, I'll see where I go. And I stayed for 7 years because it actually turned out to be really interesting. So the Port Authority is a large bi-state agency, and they build infrastructure only. And in the late 2000s, we had the Green Building System LEED, but we had this group of engineers and architects, there are about 250 in-house engineers and architects at the Port Authority, and they're trying to use a green building system on infrastructure. And so for a 10-year, $20 billion capital plan, they're basically taking this square peg and trying to shove it into a round hole. So here we come to sort of my first major design problem / policy solution. How do we build sustainable infrastructure? So again, this is what the Port Authority looks like. They run the airports, they run the ports, they run the bridges and tunnels between New York and New Jersey, they run the World Trade Center, the path system. So none of this looks like a standard building. And I also learned very quickly that the Port Authority has this long legacy and very proud history of being great engineers. They've done some pretty impressive things. They built the Holland Tunnel, the first of its kind in the nation. It's actually, the ventilation system is landmarked because they did some really innovative things. So when I arrived at the Port Authority, I was there a couple of months, and I thought, okay, well, we really need guidance for the engineering side of the house, and how do we do infrastructure in a sustainable way? So when I got there, they had already kind of started this, except it was run by the architectural department. And I don't know how much folks know about how engineers and architects work together. Sometimes it works out well, lots of times it doesn't. They're kind of competitive groups. So I immediately shifted the focus of the effort, brought in a team of the in-house engineers, knowing that they needed to actually want to use this thing in order for them to execute it across the projects. And so I made them partners mainly by a lot of cajoling, but also learning a lot about football so that I could have lunch with them. So I would force myself down to the cafeteria, sit down with the chief civil engineer and talk to him about what had happened, which I had read about, of course, because I hadn't watched the football game, but I would read about it in advance of the lunch, and then I would have something to talk about. And so over time, you build up trust with people, and then they took on the execution, the implementation of the guidelines is quite successful. They're still using it today. And this is what it looks like, right? It's super dry. This does not look designy. It's not meant to look interesting graphically, but it's very straightforward, and it's a how-to guide. It's a bunch of different strategies. This one is about pervious pavement, and it tells them in order for you to say that you've done something sustainable with your project, you have to use X amount of pervious pavement. Very straightforward. So fast forward to 2012. This is the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. This is the Battery Park Tunnel, and it's full of stormwater, surge actually that came in from the harbor. And I have been at the Port Authority for about 3 years, and in the span of the next 6 months, I went from a one-person team trying to get people to build sustainably to a large team of people leading the engineering department's post-Sandy recovery. So a little bit of right time, right place, really bad thing happening. But we basically had about $1 billion worth of federal funds coming in, and we needed to scope and execute all of those contracts in a very short manner of time. We also implemented about $60 million of emergency flood protection before the following hurricane season. So I led all of that work. It was kind of trial by fire, learn as I go, figure it out. But it brings me to the second big question that I needed to solve. So how do we build resilient infrastructure, right? So by that point in time, sustainability principles for building and infrastructure are pretty well known. But what we didn't really have our arms around was how do we build infrastructure that's going to last given how climate change is going to change what the environment is over time. So that leads me to a next sort of second round of guidance development. And again, guidance is what it is. It has to be also backed up by policy, which is, well, I'll talk about it in a little bit further. We had original guidance, and that's the memo, which, yes, in government, we still write official memos. This one's from 2009, and it basically said you have to increase in your design the temperature, precipitation, and you have to add 18 inches of sea level rise onto any project you're building that's in the floodplain. So that seemed really small after Sandy and the sort of disaster that we had there and the height of the water that came in. So we updated that guidance in 2014, which this was one of the first guidance documents in the country to say you have to look at climate projections and you have to incorporate that into your project design. So what does that actually look like? This is just an extremely simplified diagram, but the methodology is pretty simple. Climate projections that we get from climate scientists come in decadal chunks, right? So we have projections from 2020s, 2050, 2080, 2100. That's how they deliver the information to us. They're generally in a range. So sea level rise in New York City is expected by end of century to be anywhere from 10 inches to 72 inches. Well, I can't go out to a design team and say, design me something to the range of 10 inches to 72 inches. So what this does is says, okay, let's say I'm building a substation, and a substation typically lasts 50 plus years. So I'm in the asset life range of 2050 to 2080. The code today says a substation has to be 2 feet above the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance. So what we said was, okay, so you're going to build it that 2 feet, and then you're going to tack on another 28 inches to accommodate what we think is sort of a mid-range sea level rise by the time we get to the end of the useful life of your asset. This is sort of a new way of thinking, right? So what does the future hold I don't have a total crystal ball, but we have to pick a number, and it's better to add some than to add none. So this was the methodology that we came up with at the Port Authority. So I had been at the Port Authority about 7 years. It was a great experience, but all good things come to an end. And in 2015, I went to work for the New York City Mayor's Office. So they basically recruited me to do climate resiliency design guidelines for now New York City. I had done them for the Port Authority, and they were interested in doing that for New York City. So about 18 months later, we released the preliminary guidelines, also super bland looking document. Remember, this is government guidance to engineers and architects. Not that it has to look bad, but we wanted to make sure it didn't look like a glossy report. This is supposed to be engineering guidance. And every year since then, we've issued another version of it. This one, the big one, was just from the spring. I'm hoping that we can maybe pause for a couple of years and let this one sit for a while. But essentially what's happening is our understanding of what's happening in the climate and the sophistication of the climate data that we're starting to get is just moving at this really rapid rate. So we want to make sure that these guidelines have the best available scientific data, so we continue to update them as we go. So about a year and a half into the job, I was asked to sort of look at another sticky, thorny problem. So we know that one of the ways that we're going to mitigate greenhouse gases is by transitioning from fossil fuel-based electricity to renewable power, right? This is how we're going to get to clean electricity. It's very complicated to actually do that. New York City uses an enormous amount of power, so I'm going to sort of explain what the parameters of the issue are and then where we came up with our solution for how do we get to clean electricity. This is a super simplified version of what New York State's bulk power transmission network looks like. So we have sort of a spine that runs north to south and a spine that runs east to west. And right now, the power that folks are consuming upstate is about 85% clean. That's a mix of nuclear, hydro, fossil, a little bit of fossil, and renewables, onshore wind and solar. Downstate, we're almost exactly the opposite, 65% fossil. It's even worse in New York City. In 2022, when Indian Point, which is a nuclear power plant about 35 miles north of the city, closes, we're going to lose a 20% clean or carbon-free power source that the city has today. We'll be somewhere in New York City around 85 to 90% fossil generated. And this is a legacy of the transmission, right? We can't get the power from upstate to downstate because there are constraints in the system and we don't have enough transmission. And let me tell you, transmission is not an easy thing to build in someone's backyard or anywhere. So compounding that, this is New York City's bulk transmission system. Again, these are not the wires that go to your house. That's the distribution network. This is the wires that are bringing the bulk power into the city. And you can see that, our main part of our system runs north to south through Manhattan, the Bronx, and then along the edge of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. So I'm just going to go really quickly here through a couple of stats. We use a lot of power, same amount of power as Massachusetts. We're 1/35 the size, so we have no land space to put any power. And we have all those little white dots are in-city generation, because we're required to have 80% of our power capacity, the ability to produce 80% of our power within the city limits because of the blackouts in the 60s and 70s. That's a regulation. We also have a major transmission constraint up on the top of the map, you can see. So not only do we have constraints coming down through the state, we have very little spot in New York City where we can bring in power from elsewhere. So to wrap up, what is the solution, right? So this is not a traditional design problem, but it is a physical problem. We need to build more transmission that brings Canadian hydropower, so there's a lot of excess hydropower in Canada, bring it straight down into New York City, right into one of those substations that you saw on the map. We also need a huge amount of offshore wind. The state is going to build about 9,000 megawatts, and don't worry about what that means. It's a lot of offshore wind. It's the biggest commitment in the US right now. And we want most of that to connect right into New York City. So we can take those 24 power plants that currently burn fossil fuels and shut down some of them, essentially, so that we can bring in this clean power. So, oh, and you can, sorry, you could read there, those two changes right there will increase our clean power to about 65% clean energy, as opposed to today, where we're going to be about 85%. So, moral of the story, my career is all about learn as you go, right? I didn't know anything about energy before I started to work in energy. I knew some about climate change and then built these guidelines to be able to transition an old, very traditional engineering department to think about climate change. So wherever you are, wherever you're sitting, learn as you go and build the tools that people need to make change. Thank you.